we are then. I'm here with Simon van der Els, and I've been looking forward to this. Simon and I have been speaking with each other for the last few months, and they've been among some of my most treasured conversations in that period of time. You're someone who I've recognized has a capacity I admire a lot. It's also a mode of thinking, which isn't really quite the right word. It's sort of a mode of expression in service of a particular kind of perception that's brought through. It's quite imagistic. An image really helps weave multiple levels and perspectives together at once. It's very helpful for relating with complexity, and there's also an ambiguity and a looseness and an openness to it, which I think is really necessary to relate with tension and paradox. And in that regard, there's a quality of drawing image into conversation and working with that in relation to profound questions and tensions and energies in life, which I take to be profoundly shamanic. And I think that's a modality that we've connected in relation to in this strange way, in this, at least here in this digital context, where I would say so many of the traditional tools of the shaman, indeed as well the physical relational presence, well, those are not present in some important sense, and that's only been possible for the last few decades. And yet the notion of shamanism and a shamanic way of being in the world, a shamanic way of interacting and influencing in the context of relationship, is very, very old indeed. And there are so many tools and modalities and skills in relation to that praxis. And so I'm introducing you today as someone who seems to me, for whatever that's worth, to authentically be on the discovery of that path. And I've certainly enjoyed the engaging and understanding together. So it's very nice to welcome you. And maybe I'll just open it here if there's anything you'd like to say by way of just meeting that and responding to it. And otherwise, I've got a particular kind of curiosity I could continue to weave out here.
What I can for sure share is that's fully likewise. Meeting with you, talking the last couple of months in the space that you create has been a joy for me. Specifically, as you talk about this sort of bringing sort of imaginative qualities or having space to share whatever images come up. That doesn't happen too much in general conversation. So either general conversation is very, I would say, more instrumental or I'd say distracted. And whenever I'm in a more slowed down, open way of being, and if it's on topics that I really care about or that I find very interesting, then it's like there's painting going on inside, and then things are just being presented. And it's also fun to just say like, okay, I see this, and this, and then see where it goes from there.
I wonder in your case about the connection between that mode and what we've spoken about a little bit. And I've mentioned I'm curious to press into this a little bit more. I'm curious about your cultivating relationship with, let's call it sensitivity. Let's call it sort of sensation. Perhaps at another abstract level, we can say perception. And I think perhaps more importantly still, there's a kind of, and this kind of sensitivity gets at this, but the quality of reception that's necessary in order to connect to the kind of sensation that, again, most often we are distracted from. And I know as well in myself, I'm sort of broaching an area on the one hand that I actually do feel quite connected to by gut. And yet I also recognize there's a profound ambiguity there. I sense that in the naming and the whatever journey of mastery there is in relation to the perception of the kind of signals, well, of what becomes a very interesting question of ontology, and is of course one that in some critical sense I want to get into. I sense you know what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
So what do you think, how about that then? Because maybe some people following along might be, what are you getting at? What do you think I'm attempting to get at?
What is coming up for me is, it's the act of perception, but with all senses. And all senses, I mean also, how would you call it? Extrasensory ability. Since I've been sort of practicing this sort of work, or working with people, sensing for people, I've always been doing that. So it's something that comes natural to, I think, each one of us. But it very much depends on, do you have a clear enough canvas to allow those small details to appear, and that you also register them as important. So the image I'm getting is, it's like a combination of sustained attention to someone or something, so that you focus on a thing or on a person, and then at the same time allow your gaze to widen constantly. So it's like doing this. So you know that anything you're picking up from the thing you're focusing on has something to do with them. And you use that as a sort of filter. And this is something I'm practicing in, I think they call it, we use the term tracking, so that you're tracking something, someone. And that's sort of filtering or gaining information, and anything can be information. And for me, it's usually for me, it's mainly the physical body, and it can be very simple. So I think each one of us has experience where you meet up with a friend, or with a person, and they're talking about something, and all of a sudden your stomach hurts, or you really feel like something jam in your neck. And if you're not paying attention, and if you're not aware of what is happening, you might just wave it off like, oh, I have a cramp or something. But if it comes in the context of you really being present with someone else and listening, then it's your body signaling like, oh, this might be something that this person feels very upset about, but isn't showing at all. And so that's like on a very physical, sort of emotional mirroring basis, I think. But when it comes down to imagery, voices, sentences, these kind of things, that can also just drop in. And for me, I'm practicing with this, but I find it super difficult to do it for myself. So to track myself, my brain will just, the narrator will constantly interject like, are you making this up? What is this? What is this? So it almost feels like through a very dense or maybe busy channel where there's a lot of thoughts constantly popping up, this sense of, or this particular way of perceiving has to really interject or jam in short percepts, if that makes sense. Now I'm seeing that there might be something with the internet connection. I don't know what happened. I think my internet dropped out.
Yes, well, that possibly occurred, at least for me, that occurred right at the moment where you said sometimes the channel is noisy and filled. So there you go. Yeah, well, do you want to pick that back up then? So I was tracking you through your sharing that tracking is the language of that deep attention to, let's say, the total context of the communication.
Yeah.
And then you were beginning to touch on the tension you experience when the inner narrator, which you could think about as a kind of, people could think about as an aspect of the ego. I wouldn't want to name the total ego as that. I do think the ego can be very much in alignment with what we're doing. Nevertheless, we can certainly be somewhat split and have also a healthy kind of check on ourselves with respect to the nature of our own projection and the painting onto another in patterns that are very present for us. Now, interestingly, I think often, if not always, there is something to the hook that one hangs one's projections on, but whether it's energetically appropriate to sort of nail down that hook on any given person and drape all your baggage on it is a very separate question. Nevertheless, somewhere in there is that very important tension of clarifying whether or not one is picking up on expression from another that is sort of distinctly relevant to the process of drawing forth the signal that is in fact wanting to presence itself. And even that I'm baking in a lot, but that's kind of where you were in relation.
Yeah. No. That's I can pick up from that one. My experience has been that when you invite the question or you invite the process, where you just say, what is important for you right now, today? And then somewhere in the system, so it doesn't have to be the conscious mind, but somewhere something will respond, will say, this is the most important thing. And just by asking that question and then just opening the space and then just saying, does your body want to do something? Or anything that comes up, like an image, sound, taste, even just a word, and just trust that that will be relevant. Yeah.
Right. So where my mind goes, and I suppose where my experience goes in relation, is immediately to questions of the context and the support that a relational context can lend to the effort, or let's just say capacity, to be with actually the presencing of energy at all. And that's a very interesting thing, because I would imagine that the way in which people can bring themselves into the kind of seeking state, whether with a, let's call them someone they hope to be a teacher or a guide of some kind. People might refer to channeler, different thing. I mean, there's so much much vulnerability, and there's so much depth and complexity to the psyche and the nature of our entangled life. It's so shocking that it's it's so so often, the very nature of the persona as it relates to modern life really must nail down that reducing valve of character in order to protect us. And so in even just opening up to this, it's like, the very opening up to it itself is something that calls forth from me a kind of dramatism, like a dramatic element, because it's almost, it's like, it's hilarious. And if you know, and in some critical sense, we all know, but how much do you want to be with that knowing is often the question. And often the answer is not fucking now, you motherfucker. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But not with so much humor. And so the navigation of whatever the kind of relationship, and truly I believe in our world today of just a massive multiplicity of roles and labels and identities that, claim appropriately and inappropriately to invite, let's say, transformative relationship. There's so many that, man, again, that's why I'm kind of just take a bit of the energy away and reduce to that initial comment I made. It's why I become so interested in the context of the relationality that supports that coming into the appropriateness of opening and of sharing, because the ability to connect is there. The ability to see more is there. The ability to profoundly relate and connect with love and possibility in this life is there. And it's tremendous. It's tremendous. And it's terrifying. And it's tremendous. And it's beautiful. And are we worthy of that beauty? And all these things, right? So one of the things I appreciate about your presence and something I've got from it is that it's, you know, it's an interesting mixture. I feel a solidity there. I feel a solidity and also like a real interest in the lightness of the painting, but there's also the solidity. And I think that's super important, you know, because it seems to me that it's most appropriate. You know, people might argue, I know I'm going on here, people might argue about the crazy wisdom teachers, but I would say that when that goes really wrong, like when that's totally gone wild in a way that I would suggest is, you know, seek that out at your peril, is when that opening and capacity, and essentially like desire to open another to a profound jump, let's say, like a profound new area of experience, cares very little, if at all, for the trunk of the tree and its rootedness into the ground, and it just wants to jump. Let's jump over there. Look how fucking amazing it is. But actually, just a little bit away from the tree, maybe that's more appropriate. Okay, you can, like, it's pretty wild just to stretch those roots out just even a little bit. And yeah, that's kind of coming through for me.
The analogy that comes from me is like if you press too much voltage through a light bulb too quickly, then it will just or it's like let's fly a kite, but if it's very stormy weather, don't make the cord too long. Don't. So you want to have that connection to that groundedness. And I think if you're speaking to a solidity that I might bring, what comes up for me is that that's a sense of groundedness, a strong sense of groundedness that I experience in many states. So deep roots, I think. And in the case of wanting to open up in relation, if the person that does the digging or that does the perceiving, if there isn't that strong groundedness, there's also this fear, I think, for the person who is getting this light shined on them, that there's this fear that this person will also lose their bearings.
Right.
So that wherever you're going, that there's no one there to hold the reins, or there's no... I sometimes have to think about this old-timey diving suits, that there's one on top that doing the oxygen pumping, so that there's no one there. So you can go into depths, but if no one's pumping the oxygen, then you'll die or you get lost. And the other quality I was thinking about when you were saying like that it's super vulnerable to step into this certain type of relation where you're being perceived and you're perceiving yourself, because it's you're sharing perception, and the perception is guided towards something. And there I felt very much the difference between, is it because you have to have this sort of laser beam focus, because you're digging, you're looking for what is relevant, what needs to be seen. And at the same time, you're constantly checking in with the whole, with the gestalt of the person. You're checking in like, is this still okay? Am I seeing this in context of the person? And if it happens with only the laser beam focus, then it's like a basilisk stare. Then you're just boring into someone, and then it's maybe you're seeing something. But if there's no warmth, no heart coming from it, from loving the whole or being there, space holding for the whole, then you're just petrifying something. Yeah.
Yes, I've petrified some people in my time. I've petrified some people, but I can only speak to the relationships that I've actually been in presence with in that moment. If someone's listened to something and I've never met them and never had any contact, then there's an important sense in which I'm blind to that at some level, very important bloody level. But nevertheless, I joke at the petrified, although I'm actually super curious. I'd never do this, and I want to ask for your forgiveness. Let's have a look at the etymology of petrification. Petrified. Do you know it?
No, I don't know the
Aha.
etymology.
Okay, so the Latin, and this is just basic Google, right? But petra is rock, right? From the Greek rock. Okay, so turning to stone and what have you. So here's how that works through for me to stay with. I'm going to leave some of where I was going and to say that in burrowing down, in searching for what's relevant, one can find water, or one can find rock. One might not have yet developed the mycorrhizal connections with the fungi, which actually may be able to digest that rock. And so in some critical sense, in that context, has not cultivated the network, the internal relations, as well as that context for mutual support, to actually recognize that it turned out that rock that was so petrifying, well, that's nutrition too. And that's actually, it in itself is very relevant, because it's around that and in relation to that the water in this case will flow in and amongst everything else. But there's that certain appropriateness and right timing and connections and sort of a context. I'm always interested in this relationship between holding space and sharing space. And I do believe we have to work and play with the tensions. And I do think it's like essentially necessary on the shamanic path to bump up against, let's say, suboptimality in terms of, what otherwise could be. But yeah, that's what comes through a bit.
Nice. Yeah, no, I like that analogy. Digging in the dirt, in the soil, looking for nutrients. What you might recognize as like, no, these are actual nutrients, but if someone's system hasn't developed the right enzymes yet to metabolize those nutrients, then it's just like an obstruction. It's like no, I cannot do anything with this.
And this would be the phenomenology of the tortured prophet. That's one way to look at it, right? Because the prophet, Peter Kingsley will write about this. He speaks about the prophet in terms of the howl, and it's a kind of what is that? People talk about Cassandra, the Cassandra complex, that kind of thing, right?
Oh yeah.
Look the fuck out. This is super. It couldn't be more important that it's the only appropriate thing that my existential being knows how to do or is called to do is simply to scream at this. And it's petrifying to do so, because that rock really fucking matters. And there ain't no connections yet, seemingly, not enough, right? All you can hear is the scream. And so that would be the phenomenology of the tortured prophet, or at least that aspect of it. And
Nice.
and I've personally always resisted that very strongly in some critical sense, because I think that's, again, we can look at that as a phase, take psychedelics or just to undergo transformative experience as such. I mean, you can look at many different frameworks for understanding this. And look, it seems very much like the most trivial thing to say in the world. We meet the world and experience it in part as a series of waves. And sometimes they're more intense, and sometimes they're less intense. And sometimes a gap opens up to just attempt a little bit different. And that's probably where I would push back on Peter Kingsley just a little bit, in that, because of course there is something so beautiful about birdsong. And to equate birdsong merely with the scream, it's interesting to look at it from that perspective. But surely there is in that also, and of course, he would argue, of course there is, he's a little bit hyperbolic in his writing, but there's something about, in that sense, that scream, that call, that signal, which maybe only a few others can hear for a time, but there is nevertheless a call and a response. And now we can begin to weave, some possibility for shared connection and mutual understanding. Now, what then we do with that becomes interesting.
Yeah, I so I have to think of ants. So if ants, I'm not a expert on ants, but I'm interested in swarm organisms that are like a super intelligence, and that all the individuals of that intelligence make up this larger field, which is bigger than just the sum of its parts. And I can imagine that when an ant finds new food or a threat, it will start sending out these chemical signals, right? And these chemical signals have to be picked up by either the whole group. So let's say it encounters a threat, then it will send out signals that will call up the soldier ants, the army ants, because those are adequate for that task. But let's say it's a scout ant, or let's say we are for some reason I like slime molds, or let's say we are a sort of multicellular, also swarm organism that's growing into the terrain of the cosmos, reality. It's trying to it's encountering things and then wants to map things. So you're the first one, like a prophet. You're finding contact with the unknown, with something that is, and you've been wired to really sense what this thing is and why it's so important. Yeah, then you have to start sending out signals, so screaming, pheromones, and maybe only other ones that are partially wired or mostly wired like you are capable of picking up those signals, and you're recruiting them to start meshing around that field. But the tortured prophet is maybe one who is way ahead of their time.
Mm.
And so they echo the scream, and maybe not a lot of people will hear it in their lifetime, will understand this. So maybe they make a map of this thing. So they make art, or they write, or poetry, or song, or whatever. And then later down the line, people will unearth that and will be like, hey, this guy was onto something. He's actually right. And then we'll continue the work of mapping whatever this thing is. And in the mapping, I think there's the digestion and also the transmutation taking place. There's the
Right.
understanding, the integration.
Right.
That's the
Yes.
nourishment, the understanding.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like that very much. I always thought about integration through the lens of digestion, integration as metabolization in good company. Of course, the prophet is lacking that good company. And I think that's really the call I would make. And because I do think the tortured artist, I do think there's a seduction in that mode, which is in many regards counterproductive to actually the fulfillment of the telos of the maturation, the evolution, involution, becoming, the becoming of artist. I and I don't know if people would really agree with me about this, or it seems to me to be, on the one hand, something of a obvious triviality, which I like when it's felt from the depths, and at the same time, there's also just a tremendous tension it speaks to, and it's a particular mm, it's a particular voice that comes through in Nietzsche when in Thus Spake Zarathustra, when that story is obviously many, many things, but in part it's typified by this journey to and from, or down from the mountain, back up to the mountain, down from the, and then in the end he's back up to the mountain, and and there is certainly becoming on the way of that character, and there is value imparted, no doubt whatsoever, but there is, I think, an abiding melancholy, and in a sense a kind of surrender in a manner that I don't think is in fact befitting for our time. And it's funny those words come to me, because that surrender is essentially, to my reading, it's a surrender to the recognition that for Nietzsche, is his children, the overman, the children of the forest to come, are not here yet. And so basically, well, too bad, eh? Let's wait for them. Let's wait for them. And there's now, okay, he does have relation with animals, and he's, in some, deeply a part of nature in some critical sense. So one could potentially make sort of deep ecological arguments and look, there's something to that. There is something to that. But the point I sort of really want to drive at is that it does seem to me that it does seem to me that the opening to the possibility of radical address, in that sense, connection with others, no matter what has been encountered, no matter what that sense of the promise or the predicament or the plight or the resolution, the salvation of the experience is, of the possibility is, that to close the door on that, the ultimacy of that move, I think, be really wary of mythologizing that in the way that we hear in the way of Zarathustra, because what that effectively means is, to the degree you, in that sense, give up on relation, do that from your gut, do that from the whole of you as possible, as much of you as possible, rather than from the fantasy of I'm so misunderstood. That would be the basic way of saying it, right?
Yes, yeah, I hear you. I got the sense, I wanted to say, it's quite adolescent or juvenile. That's like, poor me, I'm not understood. If it's coming from just that and not from a deep felt like loneliness, but in that loneliness is still the desire and the yearning to connect. That's what loneliness is. So if you're honest about that, then there should be at all times still a way of reaching out, because there is still that desire. But if you just cut that off with a woe is me, nobody understands me, and there's also quite a bit of arrogance in that, because it's like, right, nobody can understand me because I'm blah blah blah. So that's also coming up for me. And again, I'm getting this image of an organism, a colony organism that has these feelers growing out. And then maybe in some places, it's easy to digest the soil it's growing into. So there's a lot of feelers, and they, like mycelia, they encounter each other. So it's less lonely. You find a lot of people doing that. But if you're the person that's hiking up the mountain back to the village, so you can say away from the colony, and you bring back the information to the colony, but the information you're bringing cannot be digested by the colony yet. Yeah, that's probably lonely. That probably feels like I'm doing all this work and I'm on a limb on my own navigating this terrain, and I found something valuable, but nobody has the palate or the ability to transmute it. Yeah, that sucks. But what comes to mind is what would Nietzsche have experienced if he were, let's say, alive today, and he had the internet? So probably he wouldn't have been completely alone. Big chance that he would have encountered some people who were like, yes, I understand exactly what you say. And another thing that came to mind when you were talking is, and I don't know enough about this, so I don't want to say anything, let's say, problematic, but I don't like the pathologizing of psychosis. I'm very curious. What is psychosis actually? And I'm just philosophizing here. Is that a sort of complete shift into a different, almost like a different reality? Is that like an organismal? Is that like the shift from grasshopper to locust, as in the body is still the same, all the material is the same, but it's just someone is inhabiting a completely different reality, and that's for the rest of the organism. So for the other humans, it's terrifying, because it's like this person is talking crazy, but at the same time they're making coherent sense. So it's like they have a complete different set of axioms, and then in that reality everything makes sense to them. Is that a similar kind of thing? I think.
Yeah, it's certainly something I find very fascinating. It really challenges the notions that I've been developing of sort of holding space in relation to sharing space. We might have spoken about this. Obviously, everybody speaks about holding space, and it is important. Let me tell a story of a woman I encountered once in a situation that will give us some, image, some moving image to work with in this case. So at 2 or 3 a.m. one night, I left a club about 5-6 years ago now, 6-7, and it was cold, and I went for a walk, and I sat down, and there was a few tables, and a couple people were smoking, and I got out my vape, and I sat next to this woman, or sat across from this woman who had some form of psychosis for sure, just to give it that label, definitely presenting as schizophrenic. And I've met a number of people like that in different times of my life where I've been open to engaging in conversation. And I don't want to speak too much beyond myself here, because there are, of course, people with real depth of experience with this, and I'm not claiming to be one of those whatsoever. But I have noticed the pattern with at least a number of the people presenting with schizophrenic personality that I've met, which was that at least when the nervous system was regulated sufficiently to be able to be in interaction, it's already skipping something very important. But nevertheless, my experience was one of being able to remain in actually a real coherent engagement with them. One, in some critical sense, because my being in general is open to the kind of the many spiraling tendrils that aren't necessarily in connection, and I'm okay with that. Let them ground and do what they will. I can sort of discern that there is one of the voices coming through, and maybe it only speaks every third sentence, that's actually very much meeting me, and I can sense that the being is deeply appreciating being met, because I imagine that that rarely occurs. These were people who were most likely homeless for a lot of the time. And so we began talking, and then what happened was, with, let's say every fourth sentence, this woman began to subtly, and then not so subtly, basically goad and like trigger the group of men who were sitting at the table 4 or 5 meters away. And it's not that, it's not the safest part. It's a normal part of the city, but, like, it has a bit of shadiness to it for sure. And she began goading them. And they were loud, they were drinking. There was no need for them to be in any interaction at all. They could have continued doing what they were doing. And there was no reason for her whatsoever, at least from my perspective, of not wanting to be caught up in some sort of fight, right? For anything to happen. Now, what the reason was, look, I don't know, because, of course, what happened was we continued our conversation. I could tell these men were becoming aggressive, and she was sort of demonically just tapping that button. And, people like this, often are beaten up and abused regularly. I certainly witnessed that. And it seemed like there was part of her that was playing that out. And she was intelligent, and we were having an interesting, deeply tapped in, synchronistic exchange, right, in that way. And I'm sort of looking her and attempting to communicate in this way, but I was just a brief part of her evening, and she was much more interested in continuing to enable that situation. And so as soon as that reached to a point of like that was going to enter something critical, at that point I went, no, I'm out, and I stood up and I walked away. And who knows what we could the many ways we could draw out that story. But the reason I'm sort of mentioning it in the context of, holding space and sharing space and relating with psychosis, there seems to be a tremendous, like Like mastery really is required both of the presence that is seeking to hold space for parts to come into, or essentially parts to be welcome to presence themselves without that sort of combusting into all-out war. Essentially, the tremendous potency for neurosis must be capable of a sufficient amount of containment so as to support that being who nevertheless is, despite themselves, engaged in a whole making process with their lives. They cannot not be, in some critical sense, despite the neurosis and in some sense the genius that can come from those many angles. But the sharing, of course, has to come into relation with others in that ecological context, and so, very few people, I think, in our world today are actually cultivating the art of what it is to genuinely share space together. That's something that human beings so far have not been able to do that well on the broad scheme of things. We've got systems and we've got processes. I'm not willing to talk that down totally. There's very interesting and important things to be said about that. Absolutely, at the institutional level, religious level, political level, economic level, all of that, even psychological level. But nevertheless, it's clear that we ain't got it all sorted out in some critical sense, and we all see that at the interpersonal level and how fractious and narrow it can be, and precarious it can be sometimes. So that's kind of what comes through for me. It's a really, really high bar to do both. It's a really, really, really high bar to do both.
It's very, very, very interesting because that multiple things just spark off for me. This is speaking so much. You use the word almost demonic goading. Yeah, coming from the perspective that our body is an ecosystem, so our physical body is a symbiosis between all these cells. It's a strange leap to say like a multicellular organism is, because all the cells are identical. It's one thing. Actually, multicellular organisms or even eukaryotic cells are already a symbiosis between bacteria. So this whole thing is a bacterial symbiosis. And then nevertheless, and also to speak of the bacteria that are in our GI tract, which is equal or a higher amount of cells in our body. So that already opens up this question, like, what are we? And to think that that isn't reflected on the interior, that's also a strange thing to think. So if we just draw that further, and then we say like our interior is also an ecology, and we have all these different fractions of cells, is there also E. coli present in my interior? Is there also a voice of whatever GI tract that or whatever bugs I'm carrying? Is that also there? And if we think about that, or if we use that as a way of thinking, then I can tell that then I get the image that people who suffer from a type of neurosis, whether it be schizophrenia or psychosis, and again, I'm not an expert and I don't want to fill in too much, but the image I'm getting is that there is a wildness there. So it's a wild ecosystem instead of the, let's say, domesticated or civilized ecosystem that most of us have. So most of us, the majority of us, have a sort of central ego. They have a speaker in the house, let's say, and all the subparts, they get to send in a petition, or they write like, I wanted this, this, and this, and the speaker will listen and then speak. But every now and then we have moments where we get lost in anger. I was not myself, people will say, and it's like, yes. So that's where wildness is breaking through. But if people are continuously or in general fractured in a sense, or wild, they don't have this structure, then they're way more impulsive. But there's also potential there indeed for like very strange parts of the human psyche to be able to emote, to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if it's unfiltered, or it's not going through a central authority or central position in the self, and then it becomes dangerous, because then you have these aspects which aren't necessarily healthy to have constantly on. Maybe they're healthy to have them whisper something in your ear at points. Then I'm thinking about, would in a culture who has that has more capability of dealing with this wildness, so not only holding space but also sharing space, where we have a sort of how to say, where we create ritual, or we create a container for this wildness, that it still is wild and not domesticated. Would a person that is naturally prone to schizophrenia, psychosis, or these kind of more fractured ways of being, would that be identified and then channeled in a sense? And then is the culture around that like a temple, or I'm just thinking in the soothsayers, or I don't know, druidic or shamanic ritual. Wouldn't that be the natural place for people that have this sort of openness, this sort of radical openness that is a danger to themselves in this context, but maybe in another context it will be valuable? Then it's like, let's listen to whatever demon has a super negative connotation, but we can also say like jinn or entity, or whatever feeler this person has out, whatever layer of reality they're tapped into. Maybe it's valuable to also hear what these have to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've certainly shared, I deeply share that conviction. I think, speaking pragmatically, and yeah, sort of bringing my history of engagement with that question, to bear in response, I have an immediate strong reaction that that such is the lack of contextual support for that in our time, that the stability required, at least on behalf of those who would be acting as, you use the term sort of a centralizing, you were speaking about a sort of a centralizing move in the context of the psyche, which I think is really relevant. We can think about in terms of group process. I do prefer, I'd really be interested in sort of building out the image and the metaphor, and sort of the poetry really of characterizing the roles. Let's say, I have a lot of skin in that game in some critical sense, and I find myself saying that sentence, "skin in the game," because it's critical to recognize that the skin must be in the game in order to properly participate in that dynamic. And so I'm certainly not for the kind of facilitator who comes in without actually really involving their being in the process. And nevertheless, there's also something critical about the appropriate authority of a processual characteristic that must be in context in order to be for the possibility for, we can say, coherence. And look, I can imagine here many people, depending on their particular intellectual lineage and what they'd like to emphasize, wanting to jump in at this point and emphasizing this or that turn in the dialectical movement. And I would ultimately point this back to, there's a tremendous tension and interesting relationship here between the very dynamics of holding and sharing space. So basically what I'm saying is, I'm certainly not actually totally responding to that predicament, but I sort of recognize, in some critical sense, if we were to continue this conversation more, it actually becomes really close to the core of the pragmatic skin in the game endeavor that I'm making in the world, which is expressed relationally in a way that's relevant and related, but in some critical sense very distinct from you and I enjoying, which I would value and think is critical, the process of dialoguing about it, because it really does become about very concrete relationships and commitments and agreements with people, relations with place, that would all need to be necessary. We got to really unpack the cultural philosophy in order to actually relate, with this. It gets very otherwise it's so esoteric for people. And yet the thing
Yeah.
is, it's like it almost couldn't be more exoteric in the
Yes.
actual reality of it, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fully agree. What comes to mind for me is this. I want to use the term fractal, but I don't know if that's the right term. The fractal nature of this thing is, if I'm already an ecosystem in which this takes place, I can experience this within myself. So I could train myself to be able to do this more, to have conversations with these wild aspects, and to enter into space where this wildness is allowed. And for me, in the recent years, that has been with the aid of psychedelics. Psychedelics are other means of getting in a sort of trance state. But if you actively put the invite in there, so if you work with the intention of, like, I want to have a opening to converse internally with either parts of myself or with, yeah, you would call it spirits, with let's say the spirit of the fungus, or with ayahuasca. I think that if you have practitioners who are capable of doing that with themselves, that automatically will translate to being able to do that in relation with another ecosystem. And then the boundaries, again, they become very vague. And then it becomes also what I'm very interested in is synchronizing. So you create a group anchor, you have a group center where everybody sort of can return to. And in that space, you together invite a certain way of being, or a certain, yeah, you could again call it a spirit. And that's a way of sort of group communion or communication. Uh, and I'm incredibly interested in this because I'm very engaged with the meta crisis, and with this time and place of humans in the world right now, and what is being asked. And I deeply feel that whatever wants to emerge from this time between worlds, this other way of orienting ourselves to ourselves, each other, and the world, the cosmos, is something that will be given to us instead of one thing that we construct. And I think that this receiving quality is something that we need to train, because I think in the previous X centuries or millennia of human civilization, it's been mostly human, in my opinion, it's been mostly humans speaking to humans, and humans projecting sort of whatever is in this sort of way of being, projecting that outward and only listening to that. And if we listen, we take to incorporate into the human, and then from there we go again. And what I'm getting at, or what I would like to explore further in this life, is how do we get the human as a collective to listen and to start receiving, let's say. And that sounds way more of being in service instead of taking, instrumentalizing, and doing it for our own goals. And I think this type of ecological being or ecological quality is necessary for that, because then you allow this, you're aware of the container, aware of this individual, and at the same time you allow multiplicity within that to come in and go out. But the container is necessary, but having a too solid container, that will domesticate, and then the wildness leaves. And then you have all these crazy species that you would like to have in your garden. They will not thrive. They will not even come. So it's a question of sort of rewilding the interior of how do we do that? How do we allow for a civilization to be there, and at the same time be wild enough to allow all these other ways of being?
Yeah, beautifully said. And I meet you in that effort. And we have to bring it to a close here for a couple reasons, which I mentioned earlier. But let's pick this back up again when you come back from your next adventure. I'll have by then as well gone through the process of underground philosophy, which is very much an effort at relating at a different level with this phenomena. We've spoken a little bit about sort of the praxis of ecology in a previous conversation. That's coming through there.
Lovely.
But yeah, Simon, it's been really awesome to have you be part of the Voicecraft Network context. And yeah, as always, thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, happy, man. Fully likewise. Great.